First, I would like to thank the entire World Bank team in the Africa region. And I'm delighted and honored to join the chief economists of the government initiative members. And today I'm going to share my perspective on industrial policy, which has now become very fashionable policy subject. My way of presentation will be, I will primarily focus on the real world, the practical issues, the policy issues, while linking with the intellectual and scholarly aspect. I have been honored to contribute as a policymaker at the highest level for about 30 years, and have been privileged to work with 3 prime ministers. I've been looking on all economic sectors. I have been working at the local level, the mayor of the city of Addis Ababa, and as well as at regional state. My scholarly background also focuses on development studies, but it has been highly informed by my background in leadership development and international economics as well. And in the last few years, we have been able to publish various scholarly works, primarily focused on industrialization, economic catch-up. So if you allow me, I will start by going to share my screen. Yeah, is it visible?
Yes, yes. To at least to us in
Washington
it is.
Okay. So the topic of the day is industrial policy in Africa, which is a very general theme, but very, very important. And the special focus is how can African countries get it right this time. And here the background is that African countries have not been able to be good at industrial policy. That is a connotation from this. So let's try to look at the various aspects on this central theme. So I'll try to focus on 3 important points. What is industrial policy and what it's not, because there is different understanding and interpretation related with industrial policy, and also why industrial policy is essential. The second focus will be what has changed in industrial policy of our time, especially this decade, and also to look at why some have been successful in implementing partially, and also some why they couldn't make breakthrough or why they failed. And I'll try to support with some case studies. So let's start with the first point. Why is industrial policy important this time? First, we shouldn't talk about industrial policy because it now has become fashionable policy issues in the US or Europe or at the World Bank or even IMF. We have to look at industrial policy as a critical driver for economic growth, whether it's become out of fashion or whether it's the fashion of the day. So we need to start by talking why we need it, why it's important. I see 3 important points. First, in Africa, the last 25 years, growth has been inadequate in terms of rate of growth, as well as translation to structural transformation. And our continent has not been able to match with high economic growth comparable to Asia, especially East Asia. And the episode has been quite narrow. We also see a second important aspect that our continent has not been able to generate adequate jobs, adequate exports, and also upgrade domestic capability. And the third point is, in the last few years and decade, since especially global financial crisis, we have seen that our continent has been very vulnerable to global crisis, and we are living in an age of multiple crises going parallel. And it's a way to reduce vulnerability and also responding to crisis and volatility. And here we need to start that economic transformation, industrialization, there is no shortcut, and it's quite a very challenging process. What we have seen from some publication of the World Bank and IMF is that resource-poor countries have been growing faster than oil-rich and resource-rich countries, especially in the last decade. And this has important significance. It tells us that what matters is not resource, is not geography, is not demography or history. These issues may have an influence, but the most critical thing is that growth and policy that promote growth and structural transformation is quite central and relevant for discussion on economic development. Some years back, we published a book called How Nations Learn. And what we're trying to do was to show that it's development paths, industrial policies, technological learning, and catch-up that has been quite significant in many rapidly catching up economies. We have seen the US being the leading economy in about 150 years, then followed by Germany and Japan about 100 years. And in the last 20th century, we have seen East Asian countries and now China have become among the catching up economies in about 50 years. So we see that there is something to explore from the success of these countries. First, let's try to define what industrial policy is. My brief definition will be, it's a government intervention to accelerate structural transformation and catch up. Here, there are two components. One, when we talk about industrial policy, we are talking about government strategy, government policies, government intervention. And the second aspect, that it's not all type of government intervention that is considered as industrial policy. Industrial policy is primarily government intervention that accelerates structural transformation and also enhance economic catch-up. So here we have to bear these two major components when we talk about industrial policy. Then the other issue is, when is industrial policy invented, or when has it been observed? Is it a new phenomena? Is it a phenomena explored during the Asian tigers' rapid industrialization? And the truth is that industrial policy has been a policy instrument with all catching up economies starting from the US. And the same thing with Germany, Japan, East Asian tigers, China, Vietnam, and many more countries can be added. So it's important to look at the historical evidence whether industrial policy can generate growth, and also what type of industrial policy is destined to be successful. Another aspect we need to bring into this context is that Africa's economic transformation has not been on a healthy growth path, and also the economic performance in our continent has been quite uneven and diverse. We also need to bring the demographic dynamics. I particularly raise the issue of demography, because demography, like technology, is a major factor that influences and drives economic growth. So one of the major factors is that Africa's population is going to grow in the coming 25 years. We are going to see additional 800 million people joining the workforce. And this has significant implication in terms of productive capacity and market. It's also important to note that there is no prescription on industrial policy. Industrial policy is context specific. It differs from country to country and even among sectors. So we have to bear in mind that industrial policy is linked to the peculiarities of each nation as well as the sectors. And from the industrial policy perspective, I would like to highlight few important principles that has been quite effective or observed across the board. First is the economic diversification and targeting strategic key industries has been a key aspect of industrial policy. You have to identify strategic and key industries to propel and serve as engine of the economy. The second aspect is there is a need for support in various ways. It could be subsidy, it could be funding, it could be other policy supports, and it has always to be linked with performance, or what Alice Amsden has said, a reciprocity principle. A third aspect is that manufacturing continues to be an engine of growth and an engine of structural change. And we observe that all wealthy countries have been able to succeed because they have focused on industrialization and on manufacturing. If we just bring an element in relation to job creation, we can broadly say in light manufacturing, for instance, every single manufacturing job can generate 2.2 indirect jobs. Then the issue of exports. Export is critical for scale because without scale, it's impossible to improve productivity. And then export is a critical solution on the constraints, balance of payments. But export is also a key driver of international learning. As far as you are not in international market and exports, there is no way you can ensure that the economy is growing efficiently in comparison to other regions or other industries. Again, centrality of investment comes because without investment, there is no possibility to develop manufacturing capacity or other new industries. Industrial ecosystem like innovation hubs or special economic zones, industrial zones, have been considered an important component in structural transformation, and it's considered as an important aspect of industrial policy. Again, the whole process of industrial policy, the consistent focus has to be on innovation and technological capability. And this doesn't mean that all countries will be able to focus on high-tech industries at the early stage. But for the specific countries, it has to continuously learn from new industries, new activities, and innovation and technological capability is a key element that drives the process. Yeah, so is industrial policy new and what has changed in the 21st century? The first thing we need to see is if we look at these pictures, on the dollar side, we could see Alexander Hamilton. This is the first treasury of the US who published the most famous policy document on manufacturing capacity. And that has been able to guide the industrial policy of the US. And US is among the countries among the economies that has used industrial policy to the best level that enhances innovation, that enhances technological capability. To the left, we could see President Roosevelt, who has championed the New Deal during the World War II and also post-Depression. And the US has enjoyed the biggest success in the 50s and 60s with its industrial policy. On the lower right, we could see Friedrich List, a German political economist, who has written the ideas that guide industrial policy. Every industrializing country, including Japan or East Asia, have been able to learn and tap from Friedrich List's concepts. And on the lower left side, we see Made in China 2025, which is used as the key strategy for China's technological leadership. And China is now focused on building innovation-based economy, and it has successfully been able to become the world's manufacturing powerhouse, as well as leading exporting country. So this broadly tells us that across the board, be it in the West or the East, or be it in wealthy countries, all economies that have successfully been able to catch up have been using industrial policy. And it's important to bear this in mind, that free trade is, there is free trade, or that it's economic liberalization that helps to grow and to be competitive is a means, and the current revival of industrial policy is only a change in the tone rather than applying industrial policy anew, because the US has been using industrial policy throughout for the last 200 years. So the revival of industrial policy now has been pushed primarily by three developments. The first one is the rise of China and becoming a technological giant. And this has provoked the West, especially the US, focus on building its technological capability and also its manufacturing capacity. Second element is the global economy is witnessing sluggish economic growth, and we are also observing many crises, global crises, including the pandemic, the recession in the last 3 years. And countries have been able to notice that austerity is not going to be a solution, and there is a need for intervention on the demand side, intervention on the production side, and also allocating stimulus. So during the pandemic, about 18 trillion has been allocated as stimulus worldwide. Then third element is, despite the promises of Washington consensus or economic liberalization, everyone has been able to notice that the promises are not being delivered, and they cannot be delivered. So it's now coming to sense everyone now promotes and uses industrial policy. In the new era, industrial policy is not as it used to be in the 18th century or 19th century or even 20th century. There are 3 or 4 additional features we need to look at. The first thing is, because of the technological advancement and the sophistication of the economy, the boundaries between manufacturing, services sector, and agriculture is being blurred. What this means is many of the manufacturing activities are now part of the services sector. And manufacturing is also highly competitive because of the linkages with services sector. We also see in agriculture that industrialization of agriculture or farms in modern sectors like horticulture is a key driver of agriculture as well. So when we talk about industrial policy, we are not only talking about manufacturing, although it has to be central, but also technology-driven, export-driven services, as well as highly productive agriculture. The second element has been the carbon neutrality and sustainability, not because climate change is an issue of survival, but countries and economies can only sustain economic growth if they only focus on green growth and also green transformation. Third aspect is accelerated technological advancement and development of digital economy has now becoming increasingly central. All this tells us that industrial policy has to be adaptive to the evolving and emerging conditions, it has to be, resilience becomes critical in terms of value chain, in terms of production network, but also learning becomes central. Let's now talk about the policy failures and successes. What we see is that all industrial policy doesn't equally generate similar outcomes. In many research, including my research as highlighted in Made in Africa, shows that unevenness is an essential feature, and the outcome of industrial policy is influenced by multiple factors: the nature of each sector, the nature of the developmental nature of the state, the political economy, and also the prevailing international environment. What we see, a critical factor is the political economy becomes central. Political ambition, all countries that have been able to use industrial policy with utmost effectiveness are countries that have big political ambition, development-oriented, that have a vision, and also to be able to sustain and ensure continuity. Political stability has also been an important condition in this process of economic catch-up. Again, a second element is that the state has to play developmental role. And the issue is, in any economy, the state plays some role, be it positive or negative. So the critical issue here is that the developmental state plays strategic role in many of these successful economies. Execution, coordination, and especially lead agencies have also been proven to be quite effective for the success of industrial policy. And on the other side, also the complementarity between the various sectors and between manufacturing, services, and agriculture is also considered as one critical factor in the success of industrial policy. When we talk about industrial policy, we are not strictly talking about the policy instruments. It also is a factor, an issue of interconnectedness or synergy with infrastructure development. If there is no investment in infrastructure, industrial policy is not going to succeed. And the focus on infrastructure is by itself a key aspect of the type of industrial policy economists have been using. Education, not just primary education, but primarily that lead to technological leadership is critical, and also macroeconomic stability that supports the industrial policy outcomes is also considered to be quite important. So coming back to some cases, one discussion issue could be, is carbon neutrality attainable for African countries? Because we have seen that this is one of the key features of industrial policy in the 21st century. And I would like to bring in a case from my own country, Ethiopia. Ethiopia currently uses 100% renewable energy. It's one of the countries that has been investing on energy and actually infrastructure within our continent. In terms of GDP, Ethiopia is the #1 country that has been allocating huge amount of its budget, and also tapping support from multilateral and bilateral agencies. And currently, Ethiopia relies on 89% of hydropower and about 11% of wind energy. And many could ask, what about solar? Until now, solar has not been expanded. And the key challenge is solar has not been able to compete with the cost of energy generated from hydropower. And Ethiopia has been using energy as an important policy instrument to attract manufacturing sector. And the cost of per kilowatt hour of electricity in Ethiopia has been 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour, which is quite attractive for manufacturing sector. And the new infrastructure, especially electric powered railway system, it uses also electricity. And the new model of industrial parks, which Ethiopia is developing since in the last 7 or 8 years, they are primarily eco-industrial parks or low-carbon industrial parks. This assists the economy to be competitive, especially manufactured goods, because energy is green, transportation will be green on the export-import corridor, parks are low-carbon, and Ethiopia can proudly say that goods manufactured in Ethiopia have the lowest carbon footprint. So carbon neutrality is possible, even like countries, low-income countries like Ethiopia, and many of the middle-income countries in Africa can effectively use carbon neutral paths to build industrialization. A critical element in industrial policy is the role of state-owned enterprises. I'm raising this point because we have heard a lot about privatization, that state-owned enterprises are inefficient. And here, a critical hypothesis is that ownership does not have any effect on performance. And I should highlight that state-owned enterprises are quite important as tools, as strategies and instruments of industrial policy. Here I have mentioned a few companies. Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa is one of the best models of development banks that finances industrial projects and also greening. Ethiopian Airlines generates over $5 billion revenue and entirely from services export, and it is currently number 26 globally, and it has been able to sustain its growth even in the middle of COVID-19 without any government subsidy. And this is entirely 100% state-owned. OCP, which was established in 1920 in Morocco to produce phosphate, is one of the state-owned companies that has been quite successful. Last year, it had a turnover of about 11 billion US dollars. It's entirely owned by Moroccan government. And then I bring Singapore. Singapore has the biggest number of state-owned enterprises, even bigger in terms of proportion compared with China. And Singapore has been able to build companies under Temasek Holdings, the most successful companies. And it shows that state-owned enterprises can be efficient and can be competitive and can really contribute to the culture of the country. Temasek, its turnover is 300 billion and it generates profit about 14 billion. So state-owned enterprises are critical where the government is able to focus and pursue, but a key parameter should be that inefficient state-owned enterprises should not be tolerated, and they have to be disciplined as based on the principle of reciprocity. Another issue we need to look at is how can productive investment and domestic capability be complemented? We have seen discussions on how global value chain can be one way, one avenue to develop domestic capability. We have also seen how productive investment can contribute to the growth of countries. And this is true in many countries like Singapore, China, and within our continent, one of the most successful examples is Morocco's automotive industry. And this industry has been developed, currently it produces about 700,000 vehicles. And it has been able to combine attractive global leading manufacturers with their sub-suppliers, and also creating the industrial ecosystem that helps local companies to supply and to join as suppliers and sub-suppliers. And this is a very successful model that's quite important. Combining productive investment from abroad is important to develop technology, to develop management capability. So we have concrete examples in our continent. Is economic transformation doable? Economic transformation requires working for decades, for 3 decades, for 4 decades. And one of the best examples we have is the Mauritian story, Mauritian structural transformation, which has been able to start to focus on manufacturing, on light manufacturing, especially apparel and textile, and to diversify from monocrop sugar to other sectors, and also develop into services sector, which is export oriented and also high value. So we have concrete examples in our continent that economic transformation is doable. Currently, Mauritius has an average life expectancy of close to 76 years, and also the GDP per capita has now reached over 11,000 US dollars. And we have to bear in mind, Mauritius is a country with no resource, Yeah, so the key issue here is, can cobalt and lithium drive economic catch-up, which has now become a fashionable discussion? And the point is, if Africa being having the largest arable farm could not feed itself, and Africa being blessed with a lot of resources, if it could not build manufacturing capability, in what miracle is going to make cobalt and lithium to enable Africa to be to catch up? So this is a critical issue we need to think. And this brings us to the logic. What matters is not the resources that African countries have, because the less resource-rich countries, we have seen them growing faster. We have seen that countries like Singapore, with no resource at all, even water, have been able to grow quite fast. So this brings us to the issue that the critical central issue is the development path and policies. And the main reason that our continent is not able to catch up is primarily we haven't been able to focus, to put maximum effort to sustain for a longer period on industrial policy as well as development policies. So when we look at issues linked with green technologies or green hydrogen or renewable energy, the critical issue should be about developing the capability and not about using the technology. I would like to bring you to some important pictures. These are from Ethiopia. On the left side, we see an industrial park. This is a Clinton Industrial Park. I'm referring to the examples of Ethiopia first because I know better about the economy and the policies. But secondly, Ethiopia has been one of the few exceptional countries that was able to grow at 10.5% GDP for 15 years between 2004 and 2018. And before that, for about 10 years, 5.5% in terms of GDP by focusing on agriculture, by focusing on manufacturing. And the prime policy direction of the Ethiopian government has been not to make happy donors, but to pursue policies that are relevant to help the country grow in the right track. And the government has been putting ambitious programs to implement. It has primarily focused on learning from many countries and also focus on manufacturing. Between 2013 and 2022, Ethiopia has been able to attract 30 billion US dollars FDI, and it has been entirely productive FDI. About 80% of the FDI inflow has been in manufacturing. So this really shows us that attracting productive capacity or a productive FDI is possible, but following it, pursuing it as a critical element of the strategy is quite useful. So the left side park has been financed by the World Bank. This is Clinton Pharmaceutical Park. It's a specialized park it focuses on pharmaceutical industry. Then we see industrial park of Adama. We also see the latest industrial park in Samara. It just shows the architecture by itself shows that all industrial parks are not just uniform, but quite different. On the right side is the industrial park in Redawa, and we could see here the Addis Ababa-Djibouti railway line and the industrial park are just 200 meters away. It shows the linkages between infrastructure and industrial parks. And all industrial parks that have been developed in Ethiopia in the last 7-8 years are all in locations where there are universities and technical schools, where there are airports, where they are located on the main hubs to link it with export corridors. On the next picture is actually a very brief video, few seconds, and I would want you to see this park, which was a pilot industrial park developed in 2015. Once Ethiopia developed its new strategy and policy on industrial hubs in 2014 and 15, then the first decision of the government was to test whether the policy could work. And this industrial city was designed and built in 9 months, 270 days. And 20 companies invested here, and they started production about 10 months. And at its peak, it has been able to generate and to employ 35,000 workers. And this is an eco-industrial park. It uses zero liquid discharge. It's sustainable low-carbon industrial hub. And 90% of water is recycled. And the whole pilot, the whole facilities are also that meet international standards, and it was entirely occupied. And in the last 10 years or 8-9 years, the total number of industrial parks now in Ethiopia is about 25. So I want you to see yeah, so this is an industrial park that has been developed in a short time, and all parks have to be completed in a very short time. And this has been based on the new government strategy, based on learning from some countries. And in the design of the policy and strategy, we have taken lessons from learning from Nigeria. We have learned from Mauritius. We have learned from Singapore. We have learned from China, South Korea, and Vietnam. And it wasn't just copying the strategies they use, but adapting it to the reality of Ethiopia, testing it and learning and developing based on the new learning. And this is entirely financed by Ethiopian government from Eurobond, and all parks are being developed in this process. I'm highlighting this to show that what is possible, that it's possible to have green industrial policy, that it's possible to build industrial capacity, but it requires extraordinary political commitment. It requires focusing on what matters. And here are some of the books we have been able to publish that focus on industrial policy made in Africa, the industrial Oxford Handbook of Industrial Policy on hubs and economic development, how nations learn. And most of these are open access materials, and you can also refer on this. Thank you very much. I would just, this is what I would like to share, and I would be glad to answer questions and also comment on some of the discussion issues.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Arkebe. So let me now open it up for questions, for comments, for discussion. So I'd like to give the floor to our colleagues who are connected to go ahead.